picture a room, and I don't mean a mystical incense-filled temple or something out of a movie. I mean a cold, heavily guarded chamber.
Right.
It's a closed-door cabinet meeting at the absolute highest level of government. And the tension in the air is just, it is suffocating. You have a ruler, right? An absolute monarch, the Pharaoh of Egypt, and he's just pacing the marble floor.
He's panicked.
Completely panicked. He's presenting this critical, regime-threatening crisis to his closest advisors, his generals, his economists, and the singular agenda item on the table, the immediate assassination of a political agitator named Moses.
Yeah, and this is where it gets so fascinating.
Right, because here is the detail that completely upends how this story is traditionally told. The Pharaoh is not enraged about a theological dispute. He is not like slamming his fist on the table, arguing about who worships which god or whether the sun is a deity.
No, not at all.
He is terrified of a macroeconomic and structural collapse.
Yeah.
He looks at his cabinet and tells them point blank that if they don't eliminate this man, Moses is going to, quote, spread rebellion in the land.
Yeah. Moses is going to dismantle their established system of governance, disrupt their slave labor supply chains, and basically crash the Egyptian empire.
It is a purely political, purely economic crisis meeting. And reading it through that lens, it completely shifts the tectonic plates of the text.
It really does. And that is the exact tension we are walking into today, because for this deep dive, we are exploring a fiercely analytical, almost radically structural lecture by the scholar Allama Parvez.
Yes.
We are looking at his breakdown of Surah Ghafir, specifically the first 9 verses of this Quranic chapter. And our mission today, for you listening, is to extract his socio-economic interpretation of this ancient text.
Right, because Parvez argues that if you read this purely as a religious or supernatural fable, you are entirely missing the mechanics of what is actually happening. You are missing an objective, rational blueprint for human society.
So let's jump right into it. What is the first thing that jumps out at you? Well, what stands out immediately in Parvez's framework is how he systematically strips away the mystical overlay, right? The stuff that centuries of tradition have just painted over these narratives.
Yeah.
He forces you to look at the raw power dynamics. Think about the Egyptian economy at that time.
It was entirely dependent on slave labor.
Exactly. It was built on a massive, exploited underclass, the Israelites. They were the engine of the state's infrastructure. So Pharaoh's fear is highly rational from the perspective of an entrenched elite.
Right, he's not being irrational.
No. Moses isn't preaching a private spiritual practice, He represents a direct threat to the state apparatus, to the economic hierarchy, to the very foundation of how society is organized and how resources are distributed. He is basically a union leader threatening the ultimate strike.
A union leader threatening the ultimate strike. I love that framing. But I want to pause on the actual text of the source material for a second, because Parvez gets incredibly animated about this one specific detail. And honestly, it is staggering when you think about it sociologically.
Oh, the cabinet member.
Yes. Within this religious text, we get what is essentially a near verbatim transcript of a speech made during that very cabinet meeting.
Right.
But the speaker is not the Pharaoh.
Right.
And it is not Moses. It is a member of Pharaoh's own cabinet, a bureaucratic insider,
Yep.
a believer, as the text calls him, who stands up in the middle of this hostile, paranoid room and delivers a massive, impassioned, highly logical defense of the agitator.
It is incredible.
And Parvez points out the immense sociological significance of this inclusion. We have a non-prophet, right? Just a regular, flawed human being operating within a corrupt political structure whose political defense is recorded and cemented permanently into the structural blueprint of this text.
And if you connect this to the broader philosophy Parvez is outlining, the decision to record the speech of a bureaucratic insider rather than just the divine decrees of prophets, it signals a massive shift in how we are supposed to view the text itself.
Oh, so?
Well, it is signaling to the reader that the structural laws being discussed aren't just mysterious edicts handed down from the clouds.
Right.
They are practical, arguable, rational principles that apply to the actual mechanics of human governance. This insider, this cabinet member, he isn't threatening Pharaoh with lightning bolts.
No.
He is laying out a logical, structural argument against state-sponsored violence and systemic oppression.
Yeah.
He is warning them that their system is fundamentally unsustainable.
Okay, I hear that, but I am struggling to see how this doesn't just evolve into another set of subjective political opinions, though.
What do you mean?
Well, if this is a socio-political text, as Parvez claims, What is the core structural law it is trying to establish? Because if we aren't talking about appeasing a deity in the clouds with rituals, what is the actual tangible rule governing the system that the cabinet member is defending and that the pharaoh is so terrified of?
That's the million-dollar question. To get to the bottom of that, we have to look at the foundational law Parwez extracts from this entire passage. It all boils down to the inescapable mechanics of cause and effect in human society. But to even understand how that law functions, we first have to understand where the law comes from, logically speaking. And this brings us to Parwez's concept of the objective blueprint, or what the text calls nuzul.
Wait, let me stop you there because the word nuzul translates to revelation.
It does.
And I think for most people listening, when you hear revelation, you picture burning bushes, voices booming from the sky, or some kind of trance state, right? It carries a very heavy supernatural baggage.
Oh, absolutely, which is exactly why Parwez redefines it purely structurally and epistemologically.
Okay, unpack that for me.
Sure. He asks a fundamental question about human knowledge. Where do our laws actually come from? He argues that human knowledge, by its very nature, is inherently subjective. It comes from within us.
Right.
Our philosophies, our political systems, our economic theories, they're all born from our internal desires, our class interests, our biases, and, our geographically limited perspectives.
So, like, if a billionaire writes a tax code, it is inevitably going to favor the accumulation of wealth. Or if an agrarian society writes a legal code, it revolves around land ownership and harvest cycles. We cannot escape our own subjectivity. I think Parwez actually points out the etymology of the word education itself, right?
Yes, he does.
It comes from the Latin educere, meaning to draw out from within, so it is inherently tied to human subjectivity.
Precisely. We are trapped in our own perspectives. But this blueprint, this nuzul, is defined by Parwez as something fundamentally objective that comes from outside the human bias.
Outside of it.
Right. The literal translation of nuzul implies a descent, something coming down. But Parwez reads this not as a physical dropping from the sky, but as an external, impartial framework.
So it's not a book falling from the clouds.
No. It is a system of laws that isn't tainted by the self-interest of any particular class, race, or elite group. It is a set of objective laws governing human social behavior in the exact same way the laws of physics govern the natural world.
That makes total sense.
Gravity doesn't care if you are rich or poor. Right. It applies equally. Parwez argues this textual blueprint is essentially the sociological equivalent of gravity.
Which makes that objectivity the ultimate shortcut for humanity.
Yes.
I really want to spend some time on this because Parwez's argument about human history here is brutal, but it's incredibly accurate.
It really is.
Without an objective blueprint, how do human societies normally evolve? We rely on trial and error. And if you zoom out and look at trial and error on a civilizational scale, it is horrific.
It's a bloodbath.
It is a bloody, agonizing, centuries-long process of suffering.
It is arguably the most expensive way to learn anything.
It really is. Think about it. We build a feudal system. It takes hundreds of years. Millions of serfs suffer, starve, and die under the boots of lords. Finally, society realizes, okay, this is structurally flawed and oppressive.
So we course correct.
Right, we course correct. Then we build unfettered early industrial capitalism. We throw children into coal mines, workers are crushed in factories, cities fill with smog and disease. It takes decades of labor wars and immense suffering to realize, okay, this is also flawed.
And we course correct again.
Exactly. We try 20th century totalitarianism, and tens of millions of people perish in gulags and manufactured famines. We are basically feeling our way through a dark room, but instead of stubbing our toes, we are paying for every single lesson with unimaginable human cost, trauma, and blood.
And what Parwez is saying is that humanity does not have to operate this way.
Right.
This objective blueprint, this external nuzul, acts as a bypass. It points out the correct, mathematically sound, socioeconomic path immediately. It is specifically designed to save humanity from having to break its own bones just to figure out how to walk.
Wow.
If you have an objective manual that says systems built on the exploitation of labor will inevitably collapse into violent revolution, you don't have to spend 300 years exploiting labor just to prove the manual.
You can skip it.
Exactly. You can skip the suffering and build the equitable system from day one.
Okay, but if this objective blueprint is essentially a set of sociological physics, how does it actually enforce itself?
What do you mean?
Because the law of gravity enforces itself, right? If I drop an apple, it falls. I don't need a police officer to arrest the apple.
Right.
But socioeconomic laws involve human agency. So what is the actual mechanism Parwaz extracts that makes this blueprint inescapable?
Okay, so this is where we get into what Parwaz calls the law of retribution, or Mukaffari Amal. And it answers exactly that question. How does the universe actually respond to human actions?
Okay.
In Parwaz's framework, universal cause and effect is absolute. There's no void, no empty space where actions just disappear. Every single action, every structural policy, every economic decision, every instance of wage theft or political corruption, it all has a tangible, inescapable result that is permanently logged into the societal ecosystem.
It's recorded.
Yes, an action is taken and a consequence is generated. It is a literal law of conservation of societal energy.
I need to push back here, though, because this sounds suspiciously like basic karma.
Okay.
You know, you do something bad happens to you. You do something good happens to you. How is Parwaz's Mukafat Amal any different from the standard mystical idea of karma that 100 other philosophies have?
It is a vital distinction, so let's unpack it. Karma, traditionally, is often individualized and frequently metaphysical.
Like past lives and stuff.
Right, spanning across reincarnations or operating through some cosmic mystical balancing scale that we can't observe. Parwaz's law of retribution is strictly physical, structural, and sociological.
Okay.
It operates in the here and now, and it operates mathematically. If a government suppresses the wages of its working class to enrich a small oligarchy, the result isn't that the oligarchs get struck by lightning in their sleep.
Right, it's not magic.
No. The result is that the purchasing power of the working class drops. The internal market stagnates. Desperation breeds crime. The state has to expend massive resources on militarized policing to protect the oligarchs. And eventually, the structural integrity of the state fractures.
Oh, I see.
The cause and the effect are mechanically linked. There is no magic involved.
So it is quite literally an economic balance sheet.
Exactly.
Which makes his redefinition of traditional religious terms absolutely fascinating. Because if everything is a strict balance sheet, the idea of forgiveness becomes a major structural problem.
Oh, a massive problem.
Take the Arabic word ghafir, which is in the very title of the surah we are discussing. In almost every traditional framework, if you do something wrong, you beg a deity or a priest for forgiveness, and if it is granted, the consequence magically vanishes.
The slate is wiped clean.
Right.
It is a free pardon.
And Parwaz argues that a free pardon violently defies the fundamental law of cause and effect. You cannot just delete the physical or social consequence of an action with a verbal apology. Yeah, if you pollute a river, crying about it doesn't remove the heavy metals from the water.
Exactly. So Parwaz redefines kafir. He traces its linguistic roots and argues it does not mean a pardon at all. It means protection or covering.
Covering.
Yes. In his structural framework, kafir is protection from the destructive consequences of an error through the generation of a heavier, counteracting positive force.
I love the grading analogy he uses in the source material to explain this because it takes it out of the abstract and makes it pure math.
It's a great analogy.
Let's say a society operates on a system where maintaining basic stability requires a 30% passing grade. That 30% represents a baseline of constructive, positive action required just to keep the roads paved, the people fed, and the peace maintained.
Right.
Now, humans are fallible. You are going to make errors. You are going to be selfish. You are going to incur negative consequences. But suppose you don't just aim for 30%. Suppose you achieve a 60% through highly constructive, humanity-benefiting actions, building hospitals, establishing equitable trade, educating the marginalized.
You generate a surplus.
Exactly. That extra 30% of positive weight doesn't just sit there in a vacuum. It serves to offset your inevitable margin of error. Your heavy, positive actions shield you. They cover you. They provide ghafir from the destructive fallout of your mistakes.
It is a brilliant rationalization of a spiritual concept. You aren't being magically forgiven by a benevolent king in the sky. You are actively balancing the mathematical equation of society.
We're doing the work.
Yes, you are generating enough positive societal value to neutralize the negative deficit you created. It is physics. If you have a force pushing 10 pounds to the left, you need a force pushing 11 pounds to the right to overcome it. Apologizing to the leftward force does absolutely nothing.
Which brings up the most terrifying part of this framework for anyone who likes easy answers.
Yeah.
What does this mean for the concept of repenting? Because if you can't just say, I'm sorry, I have seen the error of my ways and get a clean slate, what are you actually supposed to do when you realize you've actively harmed society?
Yeah.
Parwaz tackles the word Taubah, which is universally translated as repentance. But his structural definition is demanding to the point of being exhausting.
How do you conceptualize his version of Taubah?
Well, I think of it like driving a car with a GPS.
Okay.
Think about how you use navigation. You are on the highway, and you are supposed to take an exit to reach your destination. But you are distracted, you miss the exit, and you drive 5 miles in the wrong direction before you realize your mistake.
We've all been there.
Right. Now, if we apply the traditional passive definition of repentance, you would just pull the car over, grip the steering wheel, look up at the ceiling of your car, and sincerely apologize to the GPS.
Right. I'm so sorry, GPS.
Exactly. You might even shed a tear. You might feel genuine remorse.
But the physical reality of your error remains. You are still 5 miles in the wrong direction. The apology does not teleport your car back to the highway.
Precisely. The universe does not care about your internal remorse if it doesn't translate to physical correction. To actually fix the error in Parwaz's framework, to engage in true Taubah, you must physically turn the car around.
You have to drive back.
You must burn the gas, spend the time, and drive back the exact 5 miles you went wrong, effectively undoing the wrong distance until you return to the exact crossroad where the error originally occurred.
Wow.
Only then are you back at zero. Only then can you start moving in the right direction. Taubah requires physical, measurable action to undo the deficit you created in the world.
And if you extrapolate the implications of that driving analogy to a macro-societal level, it fundamentally rewrites how a civilization should operate.
It really does.
If a CEO engages in wage theft for 10 years, true Taubah isn't donating to a charity or going on a spiritual retreat.
No.
True Taubah is calculating the exact amount stolen, adjusting for inflation and lost opportunity costs for those workers, returning every single cent, and dismantling the corporate structure that allowed the theft in the first place.
It is brutal accountability.
Yes, it is.
And it stands in direct opposition to how almost every historical and modern society actually functions.
Oh, without a doubt.
The systems we live in are built on avoiding that exact type of accountability. This isn't just an abstract philosophical point Parwaz is making. It is a direct existential threat to entrenched power.
It really is.
If the universe operates on an inescapable balance sheet of action and consequence, then any system that promises you a free pass is not just lying to you, it is actively weaponizing that lie to control you.
And this brings us right into Parwaz's blistering critique of systemic power and what he terms the complacency of the masses. He takes dead aim at the weaponization of a concept he calls bakshish.
Okay, I'm not familiar with that specific term in this context. What does bakshish mean here?
Well, in common parlance, bakshish means a tip or a bribe.
Like paying someone off.
Right. But Parwaz uses it to describe the theological concept of free pardons, unearned grace, or intercession. He critiques traditional belief systems, and he cites historical iterations of Judaism, Christianity, and traditionalist Islam as well, that over time degenerated into frameworks where people believe someone else could pay their debt.
Interesting.
It is the idea that if you align yourself with the right intercessor, if you perform the correct ritual, or if you simply believe the right doctrine, you will be granted salvation or societal success as a bakshish, a free gift.
Without doing the work.
Exactly, without having to put in the tangible, agonizing socioeconomic effort required to build a just society.
I see the theological critique, but why does that matter structurally? I mean, if people want to believe in a free pardon in the afterlife, how does that impact the socioeconomic reality of the present?
Because it creates a deeply, dangerously complacent society. Parwaz argues that human belief directly dictates human action. If you convince the working class, the laborers, the historically oppressed, that their ultimate salvation and happiness are guaranteed in another life simply through belief, or that their earthly suffering will be magically pardoned and compensated for later now, they stop demanding justice here and now.
Oh, wow.
They stop organizing. They stop striking. They stop working towards socioeconomic equity.
Because what's the point, right?
Exactly. They allow themselves to be exploited because they view the exploitation as a temporary, unimportant illusion compared to the eternal bakshish they have been promised.
It is the ultimate tool of pacification.
It really is.
It is structurally brilliant if you are a tyrant. You don't need to spend money on armed guards if you can just convince the prisoners that the prison is a spiritual test and the real reward comes after they die.
Yep.
If the masses are waiting for a supernatural bailout, they will never audit the elite's balance sheets. They won't look at the pharaoh and ask, why do you have all the grain?
Exactly. And this mass pacification allows the elites to engage in the illusion of rapid consequence-free success, which Parwaz terms Mufad Ahila.
Mufad Ahila. The fleeting, immediate benefit.
Yes.
This is the part of the lecture that feels like Parwaz is literally reading the morning news.
Oh, it's so relevant.
He points out the corrupt societal elites, the politicians who take bribes from defense contractors, the monopoly owners who crush unionization efforts,
Right.
the executives who flout every environmental and labor law to build 3 or 4 massive mansions in 3 years, all while the honest worker who actually produces the value can barely afford groceries.
And Parwaz highlights that this dynamic isn't just about economic dominance. It is a form of psychological warfare against the working class.
It really is.
Yeah.
Because the elites look down at the honest worker and they weaponize their own success.
Yeah.
They essentially say, look at you. You followed the rules. You didn't exploit anyone. You didn't lie, cheat, or steal. And what did your honesty get you?
You have nothing.
Exactly. You are struggling to pay rent. Meanwhile, I broke every structural rule of equity. I hoarded resources. I exploited thousands. And look at me. I have empires. I have yachts. I have power.
They actively tried to make the pursuit of a just, equitable society look foolish and naive.
They want the worker to feel stupid for being moral.
But Parwaz, utilizing his strict structural lens, argues that the worker should not despair, because this elite success is mathematically doomed.
Mathematically boomed.
Yes, it is a structural inevitability. And he references Edward Gibbon's massive historical work, The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, to prove this point empirically.
I'm glad he brings in Gibbon because it grounds the theory in recorded history.
Yes, and Gibbon didn't just list dates and battles, he analyzed the structural internal rot of Rome. Parwaz uses this to show that systems built on exploitation, on constantly siphoning wealth from the bottom to the top without consequence, will always collapse.
It's unsustainable.
Completely. The law of retribution, that universal cause and effect we discussed earlier, doesn't just apply to an individual stealing a loaf of bread. It functions on a macro-societal, civilizational level.
Yeah.
It is a slow, methodical, mathematical force.
Like a glacier.
Exactly. Rome looked invincible. Its elites had unimaginable Mufad Ahila, but they hollowed out their middle class, they relied entirely on conquered slave labor, and they destroyed the internal purchasing power of their citizens.
Right.
The mathematical deficit grew so large that the structural integrity of the empire shattered from within. The cause and effect tracked them down.
So the message in the source text, according to Parwaz, is essentially a warning to the oppressed: do not be deceived by the temporary dominance of these elites.
Yeah.
Their mansions, their monopolies, their global empires look incredibly stable right now. It looks like they have beaten the system.
Yeah.
But their foundation is structurally hollow.
The House of Cards.
They are operating on a massive, unsustainable societal deficit, and the mathematical reality of cause and effect will inevitably bring the whole thing crashing down on their heads.
What makes Parwaz's framework so fascinating to analyze purely as a sociological model is that it completely ignores modern left-right political divides, and it avoids getting bogged down in modern partisan warfare.
Yeah, he's above all that.
He is looking at human society almost like an entomologist studies an ant colony, just observing the raw physics of resource distribution, labor exploitation, and structural collapse.
Right, we are looking at the cold sociology of the text. But, the sociology presents a massive problem.
What's that?
Because sitting around and waiting for the mathematical laws of the universe to slowly collapse corrupt empires isn't exactly an actionable strategy.
Sure.
It took centuries for Rome to fall, and a lot of innocent people suffered in the meantime. If the current systems of exploitation are doomed, and if passive complacency through free pardons is a trap, what is the actual actionable alternative? Who enforces this objective blueprint? We established earlier that the law of gravity enforces itself, but socioeconomic laws require human agents to physically enact them.
This is the crux of the issue, and it leads us to the most radical, paradigm-shifting reframing in Parwaz's entire lecture.
Okay, let's hear it.
To understand the actionable alternative, We have to completely dismantle our traditional, literal understanding of two major metaphors used heavily in the text in Angels and the Throne.
Oh, let's dismantle them. Because I'll be honest, when I read verses about angels bearing the throne of God, my mind immediately goes to classical Renaissance paintings.
Right, the Sistine Chapel.
Yeah. I picture giant, glowing beings with swan wings carrying a massive golden, jewel-encrusted chair through the clouds.
Yeah.
It sounds entirely mystical.
And Pauwes argues that this imagery is a fundamental misunderstanding resulting from a literal, simplistic reading of ancient Arabic metaphors. He reframes angels malaika in Arabic, not as supernatural winged beings, but as forces of nature. In a physical context, they are the laws of physics. But in a societal structural context, they represent operational laws, administrative forces, or the energetic mechanisms that carry out a specific program of governance.
So they are the mechanics of the system itself.
Yes. And the throne, the arch, is not a literal piece of furniture in the sky.
Right.
In the linguistic tradition of governance, the throne is the ultimate locus of authority. When we say the crown passed a law in England, we don't mean a literal metal hat signed a document.
No, we mean the central authority.
Exactly. Pauwes argues that the arch is the center of control, policy, and ultimate authority in a rational, equitable system of governance. It is the Constitution, the supreme law of the land, based on that objective blueprint.
So when the text talks about the bearers of the throne, the Hamlinian arch, it is not talking about winged creatures holding up a chair.
No.
It is talking about a human collective.
Exactly. It is a vanguard party, a society, a dedicated collective of conscious human beings who willingly take on the responsibility of upholding this equitable, objective blueprint.
I want to focus on the phrasing there because words matter immensely in this framework. They are the bearers of the throne. They do not sit on the throne.
That is the vital distinction.
Because history is full of vanguard parties that overthrow tyrants, and the very first thing they do is sit on the throne themselves and become the new dictators.
Right. The Soviet Union being a prime example.
Exactly. But here, they bear its weight. They act as the structural custodians of justice. They carry the heavy, unglamorous burden of enforcing the objective laws of equity so that no single human being, no elite class, no corrupt oligarchy can ever sit on that throne and oppress another human being.
Yes.
They are the pillars holding up the Constitution, not the kings ruling from it.
To bear the throne is an act of supreme service and physical exertion, not an act of domination. And their mission isn't passive. They don't just sit in their own borders and maintain a utopian society for themselves while the rest of the world burns.
What do they do?
Pauwes pulls from his analysis of another chapter, Surah, to detail the core international mandate of this collective. He describes them acting as a physical pumping mechanism of liberation.
A pumping mechanism. Okay, let's unpack this analogy because it is incredibly vivid and it really gets to the HRW of their operation.
Yeah.
Pauwes says this collective looks globally for societies that are drowned. The Arabic word is gark. These are places where tyrants, like the pharaoh we talked about at the beginning, have completely suppressed the human potential of the working class, the laborers, the marginalized.
Right. The potential of the people in these gark societies is buried deep underground. They have no access to capital, no access to education, no political voice. They are suffocating under the weight of the elite.
Right. And the human collective, the bearers of the throne, they don't just roll in with an army, assassinate the tyrant, declare victory, and walk away.
No, because that never works.
Exactly. Because if you do that, we know what happens. A power vacuum opens up, and a new, often worse tyrant just takes their place. Instead, Pauwes compares their structural intervention to the complex engineering of drilling a well.
Drilling a well.
Yes. They go into these crushed, drowned societies, and they act as a water pump. They reach deep down into the psychological, educational, and economic depths of the marginalized class, and they actively, mechanically pull up the suppressed, latent potential of the oppressed people.
They clear away the structural obstacles.
Yes.
If the barrier is a lack of education, they build the schools. If the barrier is monopolized land ownership, they break up the monopolies and distribute the land. If the barrier is a lack of political representation, they structure councils. They pump the societal energy back to the surface.
That is such a powerful image.
But the absolute key to this process, and Pauwes is extremely emphatic about this, because this is where most liberation movements fail, is that they do not make the liberated people dependent on them.
That is the critical, razor-thin difference between true liberation and imperialism dressed up as liberation.
Right.
An empire overthrows a tyrant specifically to make the newly freed people dependent on the empire for trade, for defense, for survival. It's neo-colonialism.
Exactly.
But the bearers of the throne intervene to make the society entirely self-sufficient. The Arabic term parwez highlights here is mudabirat imar, meaning those who manage their own affairs.
Yes.
The collective elevates the oppressed, pumps up their potential, structures their economy until those formerly oppressed people can stand on their own 2 feet and actually compete with global powers. They pull them up, dust them off, hand them the keys to their own society, and then crucially, they step back.
It is the ultimate anti-imperialist framework.
It really is.
And if you are wondering if this is purely theoretical, if this kind of vanguard party could ever actually exist, Parwez provides a historical proof of concept.
Oh, this is my favorite part.
He points to the geopolitical actions of the early Islamic movement, specifically the diplomatic letters sent by the Prophet Muhammad to the global superpowers of the time, the Byzantine Empire of Rome and the Sassanid Empire of Persia.
This part of the analysis genuinely shifted my entire perspective on that historical period.
How so?
Because if you read standard history, you assume those letters sent to the emperors were purely theological ultimatums, right? You assume the message was, convert to our specific belief system, acknowledge our theology, or we will declare holy war on you.
That is the traditional narrative, yes.
Right.
But according to Parwez's structural historical analysis, the ultimatum was highly socioeconomic. Yes. The core message directed at these massive entrenched empires wasn't about the mechanics of prayer. The message was, stop oppressing your farmers. Stop crushing your laborers with insurmountable taxes to fund your endless wars. Cease the exploitation of your underclass, or we will come and take revenge on their behalf.
We will come and take revenge on their behalf.
Yeah.
Just let the geopolitical weight of that sink in. It wasn't about enforcing a theology. It was a unilateral international mandate to protect the weak, regardless of their religious background, their race, or their class.
Exactly.
The bearers of the throne viewed the economic oppression of a Persian farmer or Byzantine laborer as a direct, unacceptable violation of the objective blueprint of humanity, and they threatened state action to stop it.
It frames the early Islamic movement not as an expanding religious empire seeking territory and converts, but as an international labor liberation front.
A labor liberation front,
Yeah.
wow.
Their mandate was the eradication of human exploitation, period. They viewed the globe as a single ecosystem, and an oppressive tyrant anywhere was a threat to the objective blueprint everywhere.
Which brings us to the massive, overarching scope of everything we have unpacked today.
Yeah.
When you pull all of these complex threads together, the cabinet crisis, the objective laws, the critique of elite complacency, the mandate of the vanguard, you get a picture of a society that is radically, fundamentally different from anything functioning in the world today.
If we synthesize this entire deep dive, what Allama Parwez has done is extraordinary.
It is.
He has extracted a fully rational, heavily socioeconomic framework from verses that have been almost universally read for centuries as purely spiritual or mystical.
Oh.
He has taken theology and translated it into sociology.
Let's track the logic of that translation one more time just to see the whole architecture.
Sure.
It starts with the absolute logical necessity of an objective blueprint, an external set of unbiased laws to save humanity from the bloody, exhausting, centuries-long cycle of historical trial and error.
And that blueprint relies entirely on the strict mathematical physics of action and consequence, the law of retribution.
Right.
You cannot just wish away your societal deficits through apologies or rituals. You must physically offset them with heavy, constructive, tangible contributions to the human ecosystem.
It aggressively critiques any system, whether it is a religious institution selling salvation or a political establishment selling empty promises that relies on passive complacency, free pardons, or elite exploitation.
Exact.
It warns, backed by the historical collapse of empires like Rome, that those systems are mathematically doomed to cannibalize themselves.
And finally, it tasks a dedicated human collective, the bearers of the throne, with the active international intervention required to drill down into oppressed societies, pump up the latent potential of the laborers, eradicate exploitation, and establish true, self-sustaining global equity.
And Parwez's ultimate conclusion from all of this is breathtaking.
It really is.
He argues that the true manifestation of the system, the state of heaven described in the text, is not some ethereal realm in the afterlife filled with clouds and rivers of honey.
Yeah.
The structural goal of this entire objective blueprint is to create a tangible society here on Earth in the present that is utterly devoid of class distinctions. A society where the dignity of every single human being is respected equally, and the vast, violent, artificial gap between the hyper-rich sitting in their three-room mansions and the starving laborer is entirely, permanently erased from the human experience.
If Parwez is right, and this ancient blueprint is actually a rational socioeconomic roadmap to a classless, exploitation-free society, it forces you to look at modern history differently. How much of our global political struggle today, the labor strikes, the revolutions, the economic collapses, the desperate search for an equitable system is just humanity blindly, painfully engaging in trial and error to arrive at the exact same destination this text outlined centuries ago?